Hi everyone. So this week's writer is another mystery figure for you to guess. He was born in the south of America. So my first clue is this bottle that I got in Germany. As you can see, Mississippi mud. Mississippi mud. Now you're probably thinking it's Mark Twain, but it's not. So this writer was born a good deal after Mark Twain in 1897 in a place called New Albany, Mississippi. At the age of 5, he then moved to Oxford, Mississippi. Now his great-grandfather was an old colonel who had fought in the American Civil War on the Confederate side, like most people in the South. And he was a railroad constructor, right? A railroad pioneer, and a general civic benefactor. And he was quite a figure in the South. He was also a popular writer himself. So this writer I'm talking about was greatly influenced by this great-grandfather figure and his greatness as a figure, as a Southern figure from a privileged white family. He was very conscious of having this prestige, this old Southern prestige. Now, the writer is, well, he has a number of famous works that you've probably heard of. But before I get to those, I'll give you a little bit more about his background. So he did go to high school, but dropped out quite early. Like quite a few writers, he was ill-adapted to studying. He eventually became a special student at the University of Mississippi, since the town he lived in, Oxford, Mississippi, was a university town. So he was allowed to enroll as a special student, even though he hadn't finished his secondary school education. And he published a number of stories in the college magazine and some drawings. He was quite a good draftsman. He started writing relatively traditional stories, and he published a collection of poems in the 1920s called The Marble Faun. It didn't get him anywhere. So now before that he had tried to enlist in the American Army as an aviator. He was fascinated his whole life by aviation, and a number of his novels talk about aviation, and most notably Pylon. So that might ring a bell. Now so during World War I, just before World War I, he enlisted. He tried to enlist in the American Army, as I said, but wasn't accepted because he was too short. So instead he enlisted in the Canadian aviation, and he trained for about 5 months, and then suddenly that was the end of World War I. So he never actually got to fight in World War I as he wished to. He was a bit of a romantic, like a lot of writers in those days. A lot of people, went into World War I thinking it was this romantic fight. So now his early works didn't sell at all. They were a commercial failure, but he kept going, and writing is all about that. It's about keeping going all the time until you succeed. as the Victorian motto puts it, if at first you don't succeed, try again. So he kept going, and his first real breakthrough was a novel called Sanctuary, which was a bit of a potboiler, right? He wrote it, to have enough to make ends meet. He liked to have a pretty high living lifestyle, and loved to drink expensive whiskey. He wanted to live like an old Southern aristocrat, which is why he later went on to Hollywood as a scriptwriter, like Scott Fitzgerald and a number of American writers. He went there purely for money and hated it thoroughly. So I just introduced you to a few of his novels. Now the first one I'll talk about is his groundbreaking novel, The Sound and the Fury. Now this novel was his first really innovative novel, a novel in which he experimented, because his previous more traditional novels had failed to garner him any commercial success. So it encouraged him to experiment. He knew that experimenting wasn't going to get him any money either, but he thought, what the heck, might as well enjoy myself artistically. So he published this novel. It was a commercial failure, but some critics did pick up on the quality of the writing, and especially the structure. Now he was influenced, of course, by James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, and the notion of montage, which is sections of passages of text that seem unrelated, where there are no transitions explaining things to the reader, no kind of connective material explaining the logical links, etc. So it's innovative, first of all, because the story is non-chronological. Right? It starts off in 1928 and then goes on to 1910 and then back to 1928 for a few days. So that really is one of the modernist innovations that you find in this text. The second major innovation was the use of an unreliable narrator. The book starts with the narration of Benji, this young boy who is, he's got a mental disability. So, it's very bewildering. You don't know what he's talking about at the start. He's describing a golf course, and you're not even sure he's talking about golf, because his vocabulary and especially his perceptions are limited. So they're the two major innovations. The other innovation, the third one, is the use of multiple narrators. The story is told by three brothers and then their black housekeeper. And so you have the use of multiple perspectives, which is something that he borrowed from Joseph Conrad, but expanded in a very impressive way. So as a writer, he's especially appreciated for his control of voice. He really, makes you feel that you're in the mind of an idiot at the start of the novel, and so his ability to shift from one consciousness to another is very masterful. It's not surprising that he went on to write a few plays as well, Requiem for a Nun, for example, later on, because he's so interested in voice, how to convey character and story through a very specific voice. Now his his potboiler is called Sanctuary, published just shortly after The Sound and the Fury, and it did get him some attention, most notably from Jean-Paul Sartre, as he'll explain in the interview that's coming up. Faulkner then went on to publish a number of novels that weren't potboilers. Some of them kept the detective fiction form, which he used in this novel. So it's a kind of detective novel in which you have this villain who's called Popeye. Nothing to do with the cartoon, and he's more or less impotent, but he still tries to rape this young Mississippi debutante called Temple Drake, and so it's quite lurid and sensationalist. He rapes her with a corn cob, so it was very shocking for the time. And it's an example of what you could call Southern Gothic. Now, Southern Gothic tends to be stories in which there are grotesque characters, and there's a Gothic atmosphere, but usually no supernatural event, just horrific events, and you might have these kind of slightly Gothic mansions, nothing to do with European architectural Gothic, but that Southern Gothic mansion that either burns down or is a kind of temple of sin in some way. The sins of the South, usually related to fear of miscegenation, fear of basically having babies with African Americans. Right, that was the main fear in the South: miscegenation. Right, so. Right, so that's his potboiler Sanctuary, but it's now, studied in university courses. So even though it's it's more traditional, it's still very well written. One of the most interestingly written detective novels I've ever read. One last one. This is also considered one of his masterpieces, Absalom. It tells you about another Mississippi family in this fictional territory, which Faulkner called Yaknapatawpha County. Yaknapatawpha means a place where the water runs across flatland in Chickasaw, an Indian word. So it's a story in which it follows the story of Thomas Sutpen, this man who eventually ends up in Mississippi. He's from a poor white family and is thrown off a plantation by a Negro butler. And so he decides to build his own plantation and eventually becomes the most prosperous cotton farmer in his area. So at the start of the novel, he goes to Haiti and falls in love and has a son, Charles, with a woman who eventually he discovers has African ancestry, and so this shocks him so much because of the absolute fear of miscegenation in the South. It shocks him so much that he actually leaves her with his infant son, and his drive for prosperity and prestige pushes him to commit these sins throughout the novel. He then, as I said, becomes a very wealthy plantation owner with his own slaves, etc. He loses everything in the American Civil War. He goes back, his mansion is in ruins, his slaves have dispersed. So it follows the kind of decline of the rise and fall, you could say, of Thomas Sutpen. Now eventually he has 2 further children, Henry and Judith. And Henry, going to university, finds a friend who happens, bit of a coincidence, who happens to be Charles, Thomas Sutpen's first discarded son. Now Henry won't believe that Charles is his half-brother, so he refuses to comply with his father's wishes to reject Charles, and they go off together as friends. And eventually, though, he discovers when Charles wants to marry Judith, his half-sister, that Charles also has African ancestry. So it's not so much the incest that shocks him, but the fact that he's got African ancestry. So he actually murders Charles, and so goes off, and eventually at the end of the novel he goes back to the old mansion and is destroyed in a fire. So you have this kind of, Dantesque punishment for the sin of pride at the end of the novel. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little introduction to our friend Willie Faulkner. Here he is as a little literary lollipop, a laminated literary lollipop. So I'm just going to give him an interview as usual, and don't forget to take notes as usual. So, hello, hi William. Hi, how are you doing? Thank you very much for coming again. You were saying that your roots go back to Mississippi? Yes. My great-grandfather, before him, was a railroad pioneer. He was a colonel, as you said, in the Civil War. He was a hero and a popular writer himself. And what was your youth like? Tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Mississippi. Well, my father used to call me a sissy. He preferred my 2 older brothers who were athletes. Eventually, I dropped out of high school, and I was generally considered a bit of a wastrel. I drifted from one job to another. I kept reading, though. I particularly loved Swinburne, the English decadent poets, the French decadent poets too, and Balzac. I was fascinated by the Bible. I'd grown up, I'd been, fed on the Bible in the South, as all kids were in the South. And I had a fascination for mythology too. My favorite writers, they were Melville, Cervantes, Dostoevsky, Conrad. I used to read a lot, as a kid and a young man growing up. I see. And did you actually fight in World War I? Because there's a bit of confusion about that. Well, as a romantic, aspiring writer, I was electrified by the chance of heroic combat. But yeah, I had a little trouble enlisting in the American Army, so I eventually joined the Royal Air Force in Canada. And after 5 months of training, I was ready, rearing to go, and the armistice happened, so I never got to see any real action. But I went around Oxford. I remember in my uniform. It was an unauthorized uniform to boot. And I went around to give the impression that I had fought in France. I was a bit of a role player back then. And then I eventually became a special student at the University of Mississippi. I then went to New Orleans to study as a writer. I met Sherwood Anderson, and he taught me a lot. He also taught Hemingway. I became acquainted with modernist writers. This was my first introduction to T.S. Eliot and James Joyce, and they gave me a special interest in experimentation, as did Sherwood Anderson. Your first novel was Soldier's Pay, if I remember rightly, and it portrayed the tragic homecoming of a fatally wounded war hero. Is that correct? Yeah, it was set in Georgia, but it was a kind of rehearsal for my later Mississippi novels. It was full of despair. I was pretty depressed in those days, and I used some mythology, the myth of the Fisher King. I was interested, in impotence and futile love. My anti-hero was called Man, who was, he had a girlfriend who was this kind of heartless flapper. She became his fiancée, but she was pretty heartless. It was all about the sterility of the post-World War world. Influenced by T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And, it was a place in which the old values meant little. It was published in 1926. To celebrate, I went to Europe, and France was always my favorite. I even spotted James Joyce in a cafe in Paris, but I was too shy to go up to him. I never actually met him. And you published your second novel in 1927? Yeah, it traced the progress of a houseboat full of artists. That was a pretty satirical novel. I was influenced by the art talk, artists talking about art in Aldous Huxley's novels. I was still struggling under the influence of T.S. Eliot's Prufrock too, so pretty bleak stuff in those days. These early novels provide a rather negative view of women. Critics have pointed this out. Were you a bit of a misogynist as a young man? I suppose I see what you mean. There were a lot of loose flappers, in those days. Floozies and heartbreakers. Yeah, so I included those in my novels. I did get a lot of rejection from women in those days, so I suppose that my novels reflected my resentment of that. I felt pretty betrayed, I must say. I did get married eventually, though, and that gave me some stability and purpose. 1929 was a really productive year for me, and it lasted until 1942. It started with the publication of Sartoris. Sherwood Anderson had advised me to focus on what I call my little postage stamp of soil. Now, I call this little postage stamp of soil Yaknapatawpfuk country, a fictional version of my own hometown, Oxford, in Lafayette County. These novels range through the state's history, incorporating the frontier days, the Civil War, and contemporary events, sometimes in the same novel. You also rendered the experience of women and blacks and Indians and the vanishing wilderness. You denounced reckless industrialization in these novels, consumer culture, racial injustice. Yeah, I got better as an artist, but I was still depressed by the commercial failure of my books. In a way, though, it freed me and allowed me to experiment with The Sound of the Fury, a tale about the decline of a proud Southern family and the end of innocence in general in the modern era. I told the tale in 3 successive first-person narratives. 3 brothers, talking about their dead sister. It was your first major experiment with polyfocality, isn't that right? Yeah, the 4th section was recounted by the brothers' black housekeeper. It brings closure to a rather circular tale through a crescendo of ironic and not so ironic spiritual symbolism. Your experiments in multiple narration, what we've called polyfocality, intensified with As I Lay Dying in 1930, which shifts focus to the travails of a poor white family attempting to bury their mother 40 miles from home. Yeah, their journey was supposed to echo the book of Exodus, like Steinbeck's book later, The Grapes of Wrath. It provided a commentary on grief, death, and family tensions, was something I've always been very interested in. It was both a serious and a parodic version of Exodus. It was supposed to be both comic and tragic. And it had a total of 59 first-person narrations by 15 different characters. Yeah, there was quite a hefty experiment. So in the 1930s, you were still desperate for money. Is that why you wrote Sanctuary? Yeah, that was a pretty lurid potboiler. It featured rape, abduction, sexual perversion, and violence. The action was set in the brothels in Mississippi and the bars there. It recounted the grotesque underbelly of modern society. It was a potboiler, but it caught the notice of Jean-Paul Sartre, He said that the book suggested the intrusion of Greek tragedy into the detective novel. You went on to Hollywood then to make ends meet, apparently? Oh yeah, that was horrible. I felt like a slave over there. I see, okay. So in your novel, Light in August, you plumb the role of memory and the past in human consciousness, interrogating the social sources of individual identity. I've been wondering about, this obsession with the past that your characters have. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah, the past is never dead, The past isn't even past. All of us labor in webs spun long before we were born. Webs of heredity and environment, of desire and consequence, of history and eternity. Haunted by wrong turns and roads not taken, we pursue images perceived as new, but whose providence dates to the dim dramas of childhood, which are themselves but ripples of consequence echoing down the generations. Yes, so that's, you said that in Requiem for a Nun, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that's right. You got the exact quote there. Well done, son. And quite a few of your characters seem to be burdened by a sense of sin. Would you care to comment on that? Unless you're ashamed of yourself now and then, you ain't honest. Yeah, I suppose you're right. Just one last question then. In the Wild Palms, you innovated again by using alternating chapters from two discrete narratives that had little or no connection to each other. Two very unrelated stories which offer counterpoint, a technique which has influenced many writers since then. Could you tell us a little bit about the Wild Pounds? Yes, well, the first story is a grandly cosmic account of a Mississippi flood that happened in 1929, if I'm not mistaken. You could say in hindsight that that novel is actually, or the first part of that, the first story in that novel is in a sense one of the first sci-fi stories in literature. The Wild Pounds was published the same year actually as Steinbeck's sci-fi novel, The Grapes of Wrath. So, you know, the horrors of industrialization were already having their impact back then. The second narrative that I included, which, as you said too, has nothing to do with the first story, is, by contrast, claustrophobically intimate. So I combined the cosmic with the microcosmic. My story, The Bear, in Go Down Moses, a series, it's actually a novel made up of short stories, is also a story about responsibility towards nature. But you know, the writer's first job is always to search the soul and to give a proper, moving picture of a man in the human dilemma.